All right.
We are live.
Good.
Okay, great. It's a little past 6:30 on Monday, June 1st. We'll commence the Finance Committee meeting this evening. Thank you all for attending via Zoom video teleconferencing. And we have two agenda items this evening. One, a new and very interesting initiative by the Community Development Block Grant Small Cities Program that will provide potential additional funds for COVID-related and care provisions within our community. And then we also have a second item on the agenda, the TIF discussion, and Jonathan has sent us some information on the tax increment financing process and a current request that we have now pending. So with that, Jonathan, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, please. I know we have several guests this evening to talk about the state's new CDBG grant program opportunities. The floor is yours, Jonathan.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Ansel. So good evening, and we wanted to share a little bit of time with you discussing the Community Development Block Grants, and we have several guests with us this evening who are partners on the projects that we're planning to present for you this evening, and then also later on this evening at Worcester City Council. First, I'd like to give a warm introduction to Madeline Dwyer with the Salvation Army, and also to Ms. Jamie Parsons with the Viola Startzman Clinic. In addition, we have Ms. Krista Kidney, who is from the Housing Coalition, and we also have Mr. Tim Monet, our Chief Building Official, who is also a member on our Housing Coalition for the City of Worcester. So thank you all for joining, and I'd be remiss to not mention that we also have Mr. Stan Pop, who's also part of our Housing Coalition and the Wayne Metropolitan Housing Authority. Really quick, I want to just take you through a brief synopsis of our Community Development Block Grant Program. This session today is serving as what's called our statutory second public hearing on CDBG. We had an earlier hearing where we discussed the CDBG program in general. What we have here is working to talk about how we might utilize these funds for this coming year. So without further ado, the purpose of this is to share the proposed projects and get public input as well as the Finance Committee's input on these proposals, and to be able to digest that information, and then that will allow us to move forward with making a formal application to the state of Ohio, the deadline being the deadline upcoming here on the 17th of June. So Community Development Block Grants are federal funds that the city works hard to recapture and bring back to our Worcester community. Each biannual cycle, we are eligible to receive up to $150,000 toward generally infrastructure projects, although we'll talk about a special change this year. Generally, the work that we do with this $150,000 or any community development block grant that we work with is to dedicate it toward either infrastructure or services that benefit individuals who are low to moderate income. What's considered low to moderate income in the city of Worcester, we fall under Wayne County's guidelines, and we have those here on the screen that we can see today. So for a family of four, for instance, as of pre-COVID pandemic, $56,250 annual income for a family of four was considered the limit for being low to moderate income. That really is a moderate income figure. If you're just above that, that particular household wouldn't really qualify for CDBG assistance. If we have households that are under that, predominantly 51% of the time, we can utilize CDBG funds to help support improvements in those areas. Generally, when we're talking about infrastructure, and this also applies to programs, for instance, Mr. Roger Kobylarczyk will be presenting later on this evening the Lincoln Street Waterline project, which is a $300,000 critical infrastructure project. We are looking to put it in geographically defined areas where the majority of residents are considered low to moderate income. On the screen, you see a map of the city of Worcester by block group, and the red and the yellow blocks represent areas where conditions are the majority of individuals are low to moderate income. And so usually we are targeting our efforts in these areas. And I mentioned before, we have critical infrastructure, which is another form of CDBG. We also have economic development grants and targeted opportunity grants, which we've utilized those in downtown before to rehab several downtown buildings. In additional, these are opportunities that are available for us to pursue as we find opportunities and uncover them. Generally, though, we are focusing on, again, trying to either remediate slum and blight, perform historic preservation, or services for those who are low to moderate income. What's unique about the 2020 session is that for considering the COVID-19 issues, a lot of our service providers have encountered enormous pressure to provide services. And so CDBG is giving communities in Ohio a one-time waiver to dedicate 100% of their allocation grant to low to moderate income services. Normally with this allocation grant, we are restricted to giving out no more than 15% of that. Historically, that has gone to the Viola Startzman Clinic, which provides medical service free of charge to qualified low-income Wayne County residents. It's been a very good service for us, and we've been doing that for decades, but it's always been limited to 15%. So we have a unique opportunity this time to address some of our service needs. We have a critical need to include day center programming for our community's homeless population, which the Housing Coalition here, and actually constituting all of our visitors, are part of that, and they're able to speak to that here in a little bit. And then demand for medical care among the underinsured and uninsured has significantly grown in the wake of COVID-19 with the economic upheaval that we've encountered, in addition to all of the other expenses just managing the pandemic itself. So for this coming year, we are recommending a $50,000 contribution to Viola Startzman Free Clinic. This again would have normally been limited to just 15%, which would have been just $22,000 or $11,000 per year. This is proven to be an excellent, amazing service for our community with a huge impact for those who need it most. And this would be an opportunity to help provide this organization the boost that it needs to move through these uncertain times. Following up on that is a very unique one-time opportunity for us, which is a $100,000 contribution to the Salvation Army's The Living Room Project. And this is a project to establish a day center programming for homeless individuals in our community at a time when our point in time counts have risen significantly throughout Wayne County. Well, this program specifically establishes a staffed, dedicated day center for homeless individuals and other minimally sheltered individuals who are presumed low to moderate income. The center would operate Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. and would be providing space for walk-ins and providing space not only for socialization, relaxing and communicating and being able to charge cell phones, but having access at that same time to programmed and supportive care services. Client outcomes would be tracked with this project. A CDBG contribution of $100,000 over the next 2 years would provide this organization $50,000 per year in those first 2 years to help make this launch possible as a new service. We have some additional support to make sure that we can get through the first 3 years with plans to keep the organization sustained post CDBG. That includes a $20,000 contribution annually from the Wayne County government that would be going through Wayne County JFS, a $15,000 contribution from the Wayne County Community Foundation, up to $43,300 directly funded from the Salvation Army itself over 3 years, and up to $5,000 from local community donations. These are not secured. All of this is supposed to be deemed accurate, but as they are estimates, it is subject to some variation. In addition to this, there's an unspecified number of in-kind volunteer time that will be dedicated to this. We have several community members who are actively involved with these organizations trying to help. Additionally, we do have, as always each year, we provide the in-kind service of Fair Housing Services. This is a referral agency, and we are available to help answer questions for landlords and tenants alike who have questions about fair housing compliance. So we have information there. So our path forward is June 15th. We would hope to bring this up for a second and final reading with Worcester City Council. That's subject to review satisfactory of the comments that we received from the public this evening. And again, we are broadcasting live here on YouTube and Facebook, and these comments are being monitored. So at this time, we would like to open that up for questions from the public and also from our Finance Committee. And we, again, do have our guests here who can help speak to these particular proposals. It's a very exciting project, and we're happy to present them.
Jonathan, I'll start. Thank you for your thorough summation and for preparing the presentation this evening. It was very informative. And I'll start on behalf of the Finance Committee before we open the floor to the rest of council and our guests. But one of the questions that I have, and we've seen some budget projections for the Salvation Army's Living Room Initiative. So we look at our initial 2-year funding at $50,000 a year, $100,000 plus the other supplemental revenue streams that you've summarized. What is the budget annually for this initiative?
This budget increases slightly each year. It starts from $78,000 in year 1. We get to $81,000 by year 3. And then we projecting based on that same rate of growth, year 4 would probably be an estimated $83,000 in costs.
Okay. So this initiative, really our major commitment would be 2-year program subsidy with a little bit of carryover into the other years. And again, 3 years is a long time. And at that point, we can gauge the impact, the positive impact that this is having. So you've answered my question as it relates to the budgetary process. And there was a summary that I think council received summarizing the proposed budget. It wasn't included in your presentation, but we had received that on a supplemental emailer from you, I think about 2 weeks ago. So that answers my question. Councilman Myers and Councilman Sanders, any questions on behalf of the Finance Committee before we open this up for general discussion?
Mr. Ansel, this is Scott Myers. I'm in full support of the project. I want to see this move forward, and I know a lot of people put a lot of hard work and time into it. So 100% supporting what you're going to do here. I had a question though that's related, Jonathan. Who might not be getting funds this year that would have gotten CDBG funds in years past?
So in years past, we would have taken approximately, we would have taken 85% of this toward our general capital improvement fund. That would amount to $122,000 over a 2-year project. So for example, this year we're wrapping up the South Street parking lot project, and that would be the type of project we would utilize these funds for. Additionally, sidewalks, other infrastructure that we may need in our community in those areas. Specifically for this year, absent of these particular projects, we would probably be looking at traffic signals, but we believe that we have time to wait on those and felt that this was a more urgent matter.
I agree. I think that this is absolutely the right thing to do. I think the city probably can afford our traffic signals with our own locally collected funds. So not a problem. Thanks.
Welcome.
Mr. Sanders?
I had no comments or questions, Mr.
Thank
Ansel.
you. Well, with that, thank you for your input, Finance Committee. I will open the floor up for general discussion now with the other members of council. Anyone, please proceed.
Yes. Do you have projections on how many people that this would serve?
I'll have Ms. Excuse me, I'll have Ms. Madeline Dwyer answer the specifics, but our point in time count most recently points to 121 individuals who are deemed homeless. We have an unspecified number of individuals who are underserved with shelter, meaning that they are couch surfing or temporarily residing in homes that they do not have a permanent residence in. I don't believe that we have a specific number on that. Our homeless, our Wayne County Housing Coalition does track an inventory that moves month to month on needs from different social service providers for housing. So I imagine at a minimum, it would this project would serve those 121 individuals who in the point in time count were found to be homeless without shelter, which is a count that's taken in colder months. However, we would anticipate those would not be the same individuals that we would have and hopefully have people cycle through as individuals would take up new opportunities for self-sufficiency and sustainability, and then have those services opened up for other individuals in need. Ms. Dwyer, would you wish to comment on that further, please?
Sure, yeah, I think that Jonathan had it just right about the overall number that we have come to conclusion with our point in time count. Although we know that that is not a completely accurate number, there's a lot of people that do not like to be counted. So we know that it's actually a much higher number of people who are homeless or doubling up or just live in places that are not meant for human habitation. So the number is much higher than that. Just to give you an idea of what happens here daily, we have a shelter here that houses up to 37 people, and we are usually at about 80 to 85% of capacity. Those people will be here during that time. In addition to that, we have a soup kitchen that opens every day, Monday through Friday at noon, and we have an average, depending on the time of the month, between 40 to 60 people that are already here coming in for lunch. So when you put all of those numbers together, you can see that there will be a good amount of traffic of people coming in and out. They might not stay the entire time, the 5 hours that the living room will be open, but there will be a good traffic of people in and out. And I think that as the program grows and trust is developed and they learn the different resources that will be available, then we'll see more people coming in and staying longer, taking advantage of the different resources that we'll be offering.
With that being noted, what other services will be provided? Will they have washer dryer access or access to showers other than just a warm roof and a nice environment, especially in the winter months? What other services will be provided during this 5 hour time period?
Yeah, sure. Yes, the main thing is a safe, clean place where they can be, they can sit, they can charge their phones, they can browse the internet, they can do their laundry, they can take showers, they can eat lunch. So that's the main thing. But in addition to that, through our housing coalition and all of the many meetings that we've had, what we see is this space becoming some sort of a hub for all the other behavioral and mental health agencies that offer services. We also see it as a place where we can even offer job training, life skill classes, help with resumes, help with parenting classes. And there's a lot of different agencies of the community that have offered in-kind services to come in, including Biola Starsman Clinic, health assessments, dental cleanings. There will be quite an array of services that will be provided downtown for people that lack transportation or lack the means of getting to all of these other agencies. They will be provided right here.
It's a wonderful concept. Thank you for initiating this. And it is a very unique coalition that has been engaged in this discussion and needs assessment. So it sounds like a marvelous experiment, and only time will tell in terms of the use and the positive impact potential that this may have. And it certainly does, as many of our discussions on city council have focused on where the homeless go during the day. And they roam the streets and they congregate, and there's been potential issues for concern associated with that. Now this will be a wonderful landing ground for them to engage and take care of themselves and become better equipped to deal with the challenges of being low income, or just the camaraderie and the support of the group environment is always certainly very positive. And with the additional support services from 180 and the Viola Startzman Free Clinic and the Housing Coalition, it sounds like a marvelous collaboration. So thank you for defining a little bit better in terms of the services that are going to be provided through this initiative.
Is anyone to be excluded from this? Is this only based on income?
And not wanting to speak out of turn, but this is what's called a low barrier shelter, meaning that it will be open to everyone. The exception being, and please, Major Dwyer, correct me if I'm wrong, that would be individuals who are 18 and who would be under 18 without an adult. And that would, again, be because of the low barrier shelter nature of it. That's more of a means to protect individuals who are under 18.
Correct.
If I could ask, this is Jen Warden. Will the new living room structure, is that a new structure, or is it repurposing existing space? And if it is a new structure, will it add to the Salvation Army's capacity for beds?
We will be repurposing, I suppose, some of the space, particularly the space where we hold our soup kitchen right now. That is the main space where they will be using. We are right now in the process of remodeling our laundry facilities, adding more washers and dryers and some folding and sitting space also there for people can be utilizing. It does not affect the capacity of beddings in the shelter. That will remain the same. We're just kind of like restructuring the way we use the space to be able to offer more programs.
Thank you.
Any other points for discussion?
Tim, if you wouldn't mind weighing in, this is Bob Brenneman. Tim Monet, I know a number of the people of our guests involved went to Newark, Ohio to see a shelter down there that had some really good capabilities and characteristics. So would you mind jumping in and talking about that a second?
Sure, thank you, Mayor. While it is a newer concept, it's certainly not one that hasn't been tried and doesn't have a track record. It does, it's been in communities. So we did go to Newark and saw a very similar project. And there's, as was mentioned, a whole array of services that folks come and take advantage of. The laundry, for example, there really is no place for anyone to do laundry other than the laundromat up there on Bell Avenue, which is quite a distance from folks lugging laundry from downtown or other areas. So it's very inconvenient. So the laundry is something that was there in Newark. And again, they have people that they called navigators that were very familiar with the social service agencies, mental health professionals, where people can get where they need to go. And as was mentioned, Madeline mentioned, it might be difficult for them to get a ride to an appointment. So here they're right downtown in an area where a ride can be arranged for them. So it's easy for them to access services. So it's been fairly successful there in Newark. I know folks in the city administration there have commented how they've noticed people accessing that, and it is a place for them to go and get these services and go and have a place to sit and relax and congregate, charge their phone. And they've been taking advantage of it there, and we hope that it's as successful here.
Tim, what is the funding vehicle in the Newark's program?
Maybe Krista would be better to answer that, because I know she had some conversations with the director on that.
Thank you, Tim. I'm trying to remember back I knew you were going to pin that one on me. They had some funding from some local businesses. I think a local foundation helped with some of the funding, and then they were backed a lot with their faith-based community. A lot of donations from the faith-based community and meals.
The director, his salary was actually being paid by the organization that he worked for. I can't remember the name of it.
He was the chaplain of the Licking County Jail. So the Jail Ministries, I think, was the name of that organization.
Yeah, so the jail ministry did provide some funding and his salary. And so he was sort of the champion of that center and getting it started, and really with very few funds, but there's been a whole variety of people that have come to the plate to help in a similar way to this model. I think Jonathan had a nice slide there showing some of the sources of funding here, and you see that there's a lot of different participants in the funding mechanism.
I'm curious, was Licking County involved in part of the funding like Wayne County has offered, and is the city of Newark engaged in any funding?
The city of Newark did not provide any funding. I don't believe so. They did, I don't even believe the building. Did they provide the building?
It was a local foundation, I believe.
Yeah, it was the local foundation. That's correct. So local foundation provided the building, and I think the city helped them vacate an alley adjacent to the building, but actually did not provide any funding.
Krista, was it the Reese Foundation?
It was, I don't remember what the name of the foundation was, to be honest.
Okay.
One thing that was helpful also, perhaps mentioning, we were able to gather a lot of input from this organization. However, what is being proposed here, because we do have support from our county commissioners more directly, is longer hours being offered here at Worcester, in addition to more direct access of services, since this is being housed with the Salvation Army's current operations.
Mike Bangdyke here. Could you refresh my recollection what the contribution is at the county?
So the county commissioners have authorized $20,000 per year for the next 3 years, which will be funneled to the organization through the Job and Family Services function of the county.
Very gracious of them. Well, great. If there aren't any more questions or comments, since we have about 30 minutes left, let's go to the TIF discussion. Jonathan, thank you everyone for participating and providing feedback and comments. It's certainly a very, very needed initiative, and it could be a great public service for our community. So thank you all for your hard work and vision relative to getting something structured to service that community, which is an vital need within our city here. So well done. And we'll have that on first reading this evening. Jonathan, TIF.
All right, thank you very much. And no further comments on Facebook or YouTube from our audience as well. So moving on to the next item. Thank you, everybody. We shared with you a little earlier a memo that talked about our process that we shared with Worcester Growth for tax incremental financing. So I hope that you were able to see this memo that we shared earlier. And the reason why we're bringing this is that we have always had the opportunity to utilize programs like tax increment financing. However, for the city of Worcester, it has been well over a decade since we last completed our last round of TIF, which was focused on an industrial building project that saw the rehabilitation of Long Road and the intersection of Akron Road. So recently we've had inquiries from a couple of different developers, and most recently a firm request to develop residential housing. And Ohio is unique in that it is one of the few states that does allow tax incremental financing to be utilized to residential projects in the absence of blight. This is something that is relatively new for it's new for us. In the state of Ohio, it's really been in the last 18 to 24 months that communities have looked at TIF for projects like single family residential or exclusively residential projects. The way that it works essentially is very much like a community reinvestment or enterprise zone. There is a tax exemption that is placed on the property. Unlike an EZ or a CRA, the owners of that property, they still pay the same amount to the county auditor that they would have if the property was fully taxed. That difference in that difference between what is exempted actually goes into a special infrastructure fund that, in our case, the city would own. TIFs can also be implemented by counties as well, and it works in a similar fashion. But individuals pay the same amount to the county auditor that they would if it were taxed at 100%, but a proportion of the increase in tax value goes into this fund, and that fund can be used to fund and finance infrastructure. For years, a lot of communities have utilized it as a way to redirect revenues in order to be able, toward the end of a 20 or 30-year cycle, have money left over to repave a large area of streets. And that way, that money came from this TIF. It would have gone to some other taxing entities like libraries, schools, county government, or the city's general fund. But in this case, it's able to redirect that to a specific infrastructure fund. And depending on the community, and particularly for cities, that frees up dollars for infrastructure elsewhere. That's how it has historically worked. More recently, developers have requested that TIF be utilized to support infrastructure within their internal streets. So for instance, a developer requests to build a large apartment complex, and that's a series of buildings, and they want a roadway to serve exclusively that development. They can call that public infrastructure, and they can request communities to fund that for them. And they essentially get a grant from the city, or they can get financing from a bank on the promise of those future tax revenues that they'll collect. In practice, TIF generally, as we have observed it in most, or in a lot of Ohio communities, we generally place on a 100% 30-year tax exemption. That means any increase in the value of the property for 30 years, 100% of those revenues comes into this infrastructure fund. Usually, a significant portion of that fund is then given back to, like, let's say a local school district. And almost always our school districts are receiving a minimum level of that. It can be, and it's completely up to the community, and it's on a project by project basis, but communities can set up TIFs that donate back all of the revenues to school districts or to any other district that district would have received otherwise. So there's virtually no impact to that district. What it comes down to, though, is especially in the case of financing a project using TIF, the community definitely wants to make sure that the development occurs and that it generates the tax value necessary so that the community can collect enough revenues to pay back the cost of the infrastructure that, again, it either built on behalf of a private developer or it gave a grant to the developer, in effect paying for the public infrastructure that it's going to own. Again, Ohio's unique in that we allow this for residential. One of the other differences with CRA and EZ that we're more familiar with, those are blanket level abatements, and TIF can be much more surgical, and it's intended to provide only the minimum level of assistance needed in order to help a project come to fruition provided that the community deems that it is worthy of public incentives. And there are two ways to approach it. One, from the aspect of, can TIF redirect enough revenues from other taxing jurisdictions into the city's infrastructure funds? And then two, using it as an incentive to provide a grant or services to a developer to get a certain level of development moving forward. So in addition to this, typically with a TIF, when somebody requests a TIF, the community that is going to enact it needs to put the legislation for TIF together in advance. And they need to then share a copy of that legislation with organizations that are going to be impacted by the TIF, like schools, or in our case, it would be county governments. So those entities would have rights to review and comment, and depending on the level of TIF requested, possibly even amend the amount of TIF that, or I should say, amend the amount of the exemption that they're willing to take. So there's a lot of coordination that has to take place before we would actually arrive to council to present an application. It's a little different with a CRA and an EZ. We generally, when we get those applications in, we're having a conversation with the developer. We always require an informational interview up front. We help them complete a compliant application. And then once that's complete, we do a summary. And at that time, we're sharing it with Worcester City Council at the same time that we're providing it to our schools and our county. But usually the county is not involved with CRA and EZ, but sometimes they are. And then it goes to Worcester Growth, and then it goes to Worcester City Council to finally review and assess and consider an application. So TIF is a little bit unique in that there's a lot of extra work that takes place up front. It's very advantageous, again, in that it's surgical, so it doesn't leave the community giving up all of the revenues that would be given up with a straight, flat tax abatement. But at the same time, because it's more transparent, we get a lot more information. There's more analysis that can be done. But there's a question of, how do we coordinate this? And so what we're here for this evening is we wanted to share with you how we typically do evaluate economic development incentives when it comes to tax incentives, and wanted to get the Finance Committee's input on that, and then also input on process. And has the process we've used for CRA and EZ, where we do that analysis up front with the developer, and if they meet the minimum state criteria, we provide it to Worcester Growth, and then it goes to council. Does that model work with TIF? Are there ways that maybe we can enhance this process, just considering that there is more coordination with other agencies up front, including schools and counties? Does council want to be involved in this at an earlier stage? Some communities, and again, anybody can propose a TIF at any time. It's really up to the community to determine whether or not an incentive is appropriate. But essentially, that's what we're trying to gather this evening is, does our process fit? And do we automatically forward every request that comes in directly to council? Does council want us to do any type of screening? Being that this is a relatively new happening in the state of Ohio, and it's a new opportunity for us.
Hey, Jonathan, there was a lot of moving pieces to that explanation, and it is a complex model. Just for clarity, let me kind of give the Cliff Note version in terms of my interpretation of how the TIF will work. So if a developer had a parcel that they wanted to develop, they could request a TIF. And let's just use an example. So if they have 25 lots and the infrastructure improvements for that development was $10,000, $250,000, when they commence that project, they would have to sell the lots for X dollars to cover the cost for that infrastructure. Through TIF request, the city can initiate those improvements that allows the developer to be a bit more competitive in their development process, of which they can reduce the sell price of the house by $10,000 in the model that I just highlighted. If it's a 25 lot subdivision on 6 acres, and the developer then is allowed to market the home at a lower cost, which will allow the buyer the opportunity to have a home at a lower price with the financing over 10, 15, 20, 30 years. But now that house is going to be valued a little lower because they bought it for $10,000 less, because the city did provide the TIF infrastructure improvements to reduce the price. But over the period of the TIF, a portion of that homeowner's taxes will go into the TIF pool. The school will get their amount of TIF, but over that 30-year period, or whatever the TIF timeframe that is negotiated at the commencement of the process, will be reimbursed to the city at 100%. So the city gets the infrastructure period over the 20 or 30 years. The developer gets a lower price basis, the homeowner gets a lower cost basis, and the schools now receive their portion of a $180,000 house versus $190,000 or $200,000 house on the model that I provided. But everybody is made whole through the process without a 10-year or a 15-year abatement, and it allows the developer to be more competitive, the homeowner to be able to buy a home at a lower cost, and over the long-term financing period, it's cost neutral to the city. I mean, is that a correct understanding of the concept of the TIF?
I would say that's an ideal of how it could work. If it works like that, it depends on the actual number of homes, what they actually sell for, and what the request of the city is. So for instance, if someone is asking for $2 million and the homes are only worth, let's say, $100,000, the city may never recover enough money over the period of time to pay that back. And so those are some things that we can make some educated guesstimates about when we are talking with individuals and looking at metrics.
But that's part of the negotiating process.
Correct.
When the developer's coming in, you know the cost of the raw acreage, you have a good understanding of the infrastructure improvements that can reduce the cost for the builder, the developer. Thus, he'll pass that through to the homeowner. And then also know the total cost over the amortization period to know what, based on our portion of the TIF recovery, will offset that initial upfront cost. So we're going to need the city's involvement to make those calculations before it comes to council, and also before it goes to Worcester Growth for consideration. But again, the schools would receive incremental tax dollars, even if it's $150,000, $200,000 house over a vacant lot, and the city is going to, based on the negotiation process, recover a significant portion of their initial investment. Or the TIF doesn't work, and that's part of the negotiations process.
Correct.
Okay. Okay. That was my understanding, and the concept has merit, and over a longer duration, I think it's a win-win-win for all parties involved, because it provides a consumer need for demand of housing. It allows the developer to go in initially at a little lower cost that he's going to pass through to the homeowners, and we receive incremental tax for that developed property, of which we're going to use to offset our initial investment, while all along the schools are receiving their funding based on the value of that home, as they would in any normal situation, other than the homeowner is going to have a little lower cost basis for that house. But as that house is reevaluated 10, 15 years down the road, the $200,000 house in 10 to 15 years is going to be now revalued at $250,000, of which will receive more tax receipts, as well as the school receive more tax receipts. So there is the upside on the appreciation valuation of the residential property, correct?
Correct. One of the things that we try to take a look at, as with any incentive, is that we will, with a normal analysis, we still look for the financing gap, which is, okay, developer, you wish to have this constructed. The idea is that we do want to lower home prices. And so some of the things that we would look for typically would be, what does this do in terms of revenue generation for the community? But also, can we get a commitment from the entities that are constructing the homes to indeed make sure that they will be marketable and available at a specified price point that the community deems as appropriate? The other thing is, is there a gap? Does providing this incentive make a difference to the development? If the development cannot move forward without some assistance, and housing is necessary, then absolutely that's something that we would want to take a look at. If the development is going to occur anyway, it may be better to forego providing incentive for that, saving those funds and resources for other projects. And that's part of that negotiation as well. And I think that's what we were also hoping to get a little bit of feedback on, because there is a lot of detail that comes into the negotiation side of this. And we wanted, very typically, if we can't demonstrate that it's necessary for a developer to have the incentive to move forward, or if we can't get a commitment on what a home value might be, and if that home value is at a level that would be beneficial to the consumer needs of our community, we have a very difficult time being able to tell members of Worcester Growth and Worcester City Council that this is a deal that we would recommend. And so that can sometimes put...
Let me interject. With that being noted, your point is understood. So again, back to my conceptual. The builder says we're going to have 25 homes built within 3 years. So it's 3 years from now and they have 5 homes built. And we've put $250,000 in for infrastructure. And it's not going to be now, based on the initial projections, a reasonable payback period, because he has undeveloped land of which the city has created for them. So there is a downside associated with the TIF repayment based on the initial calculations. And then also the cost levels or the sell price of the homes, it has to be within a targeted range going into it. So the real downside is the development doesn't proceed as successfully as we had planned or projected. And over that payback period of 20 or 30 years, whatever is negotiated up front, the development is sitting half developed. The city hasn't received its funding back for that property development. That's the downside, long and the short of it.
Correct. So we would do as much as we can to get validation, agreements, try to pull in multiple parties. We think it's typically appropriate that you would have basically anybody who's responsible for building the actual structure to also be part of that agreement, to be a party of that agreement.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. And I guess our question is, at what point do we move forward, I guess, with presenting something to council? If there will be times that administration is going to not feel comfortable with projects. We do and have historically presented those anyway, and it provides a very good check and balance to be able to present a project to council, even if it may not have a staff recommendation. That's a very important check and balance. It gives council the ability to qualitatively weigh in on what's important for the community. We do have certain guidelines in place for CRA and EZ. TIF, it's relatively wide open. We had a comment earlier, should we have additional criteria if we're talking residential TIF? And that's one of the other questions that, again, I believe at the time initially I'd said that, from a staff perspective, I have a relatively neutral position on that. But as we encounter more requests in the future, and right now I will say we have one active request, we have another request that is pending. So I think that we'll see, and that's a good sign. There's a lot of interest in our community, and that's very healthy, especially in these times. But as we process this and we work through negotiations, what I'm hearing is that we do want to make sure that we secure all parties to the development before we would proceed with an application. And are there other general criteria that this committee would recommend that we make sure that we tie down before we move forward with drafting that legislation, sharing it with our county commissioners and Worcester Growth and City Council?
Well, I was expecting.
May I weigh in here, Mike Beindike? I had
Please.
asked more than 2 months ago to be involved. You talk about transparency. I had envisioned, because do we have a TIF ordinance that is like a boilerplate ordinance that say, here are the basic requirements before you even file an application? Or are we just going on a case-by-case basis and drafting the legislation?
Generally, in practice, in other communities, it appears to be case-by-case basis. And so a few months ago,
what do we have? That wasn't the question. What other communities have?
So
what do we have?
Back in February, we shared what's on the screen here with Worcester Growth, and Mr. Beitendijk, we provided this to you as well.
We do not have an ordinance that's a boilerplate ordinance.
We do not.
That was the question, Mr.
Yes, that's what we're asking this evening is, do we want that?
I was at those meetings and I asked to be involved in drafting some sort of legislation, because you started out, or at least part of this meeting was, seeing what involvement the city council wanted to be in. I think city council ought to be involved with drafting a basic TIF ordinance upon which all other TIFs are then based upon. And that's when the city administration comes into play, is to see if the application meets those basic criteria that were developed by the city council. Because after all, we're the law generating part of government. And then they can't say that there's an abuse of discretion, because there's a basic ordinance out there that says, here are all the hoops you have to jump through to submit a TIF.
Well, and that's why we wanted to have the conversation today. We did want to earlier provide some general guidelines of what the administration would feel comfortable presenting. I think that there is a distinction between residential TIFs and the more traditional commercial TIFs.
We can bifurcate it, but
sure. Yeah,
I was never involved in what you've produced now, which, frankly, at this point in time, I am sounding like a grumpy old man, because I made it clear when you presented those ideas back in February. I made that clear at another meeting back in March. And I made it clear at our most recent meeting. So I don't know what it gets to have my voice.
Mr. Beitendijk, if I may interrupt for a moment, most of what we're presenting here is mostly straight from their Ohio Vice Code.
Well, I get that, but I asked to be involved and I wasn't. And
I understand, but it's not like we have developed policies without you or without the involvement of council. And mostly what is being presented. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Mr. Beitendijk, if I'm not mistaken, you are president of city council. If you want council to do this, I would say you would direct your different committees, whether it's laws and ordinance, whether it's finance, whatever committee, you think is the one to lead this and would have done something. I think
Well-
it's the administration's purpose and responsibility to give every bit of guidance we can, because we are the group that studies these kind of things and are paid to study these kind of
And
things.
I get that, Mayor, but all I asked was to be involved in the process.
Well, you can be fully involved in the process. You make the process. It's on your back right now. Have at it.
Let's do this. This has been a very productive discussion. And I think we have a general consensus that we would like to see, as we have for CRA guidelines through our codified ordinances, and we do for our tax abatements. This is new. I'm sure there's template legislation out there. I don't know. Maybe that's an incorrect assumption that we could look at a draft. You've got the foundation in terms of the process for TIF incentive flow chart. You have the process for processing applications, but we don't have criteria in place in terms of what percentage of the development it will be a baseline for a pilot program or a TIF initiative. But can we look at a existing piece of legislation that other municipalities may have as a template or guidelines for initial consideration, as TIFs may be something that's going to become more to the forefront if we're not going to pursue a citywide CRA type of initiative. So understanding the concern, but we don't have any of the guidelines documented in terms of the format for the criteria for the review process. And as we do the CRAs and the EZs, those are applied. We have a nice questionnaire template that we ask the participants to complete. That's submitted to the city. It goes through the process review through Worcester Growth, and at everyone's blessing or lack thereof, it can still come before council for council's final review and approvement or disapprove of the request. So can we develop, or is there, and Mr. Scavelli, this might be a good question for you. Is there a template ordinance out there that identifies the criteria for TIF and the standard application that we would review in a TIF request?
Mr. Ansel, the criteria that we've been working from, and that I think most cities that we've seen anyway so far are working from, come from the Ohio Vice Code, and they're laid out there. That's
Good.
what we base things on. We could develop and we could limit those things to only the criteria that we're willing to do, but we'd have to work within that initial framework. As far as what I have seen so far from different legislation, most of them are just setting up their particular TIF. They are not setting up criteria like our enterprise zone criteria and things like that. We could do that, and we can limit what we can do, but that would have to be a decision that council would make as to what they would choose to want to limit. So if there are ideas out there, what we can do is, I guess I was misunderstanding what council was looking for there, because I didn't know that we were looking for limiting criteria. I thought that what we were basically looking to do was set this up and let city council vote on it, which is what we were working on. We can slow down, we can switch tracks, and we can set up limiting criteria to limit what we can do. But we're going to need some input as to what actually city council wants. So what I think probably the best thing to do is maybe have a meeting sometime in the future, real soon, where we talk about what all those criteria are within their Ohio Vice Code, so that everyone within council can understand those things, and then they can make suggestions as to how they would like them limited within the city of Worcester.
Perfect. So that being noted, here's my summary so we can conclude and be close to on time, because we have a long agenda this evening. The Laws and Ordinance Committee, working with you, Mr. Scavelli, and the Ohio Revised Code template, can begin that process to review what the Ohio Revised Code consists of and any modifications in terms of our criteria that we would want to customize for this process to be presented and reviewed through the administration, Worcester Growth, and ultimately Worcester City Council. And if 80% of the template is there through the Ohio Revised Code, we can go ahead and identify it. And it should be a pretty easy commentary, and we'll attend, I'm sure all council will attend the Laws and Ordinance Committee. My logic would be that it has to have, if we're going to make it a 20 or 30-year TIF, based on the projections of the development, how will the city recoup those funds for the initial investment made for that project development? And that's a pretty easy calculation based on the assumption that if it's a 40-unit residential, 50-unit, a 25, that it hits that level within a certain period of time. And if it doesn't, just like we have our EZ, if the business doesn't maintain their enterprise for 10 years after the EZ, the clawback, which we've never enforced, I don't believe, at least as long as I've been on council, that we have a means to recoup our investment or our tax reduction over that time period. So again, we can talk more in council session or committee session, but I think the first good step would be Laws and Ordinance to champion this, working with you, Mr. Scavelli, and the city administration. And then the rest of council, I'm sure, will participate to validate what our Worcester guidelines will be against the Ohio Revised Code, because we can add those nuances to make sure that we accomplish what we want to accomplish for the city of Worcester. So healthy discussion. I am going to be abrupt and conclude the Finance Committee meeting for this evening so we can be reasonably on time for our council meeting that's 3 minutes past the start time right now. So with that, thank you for your input. Thank you for participating this evening. And President Bidendijk, I'll conclude, and we will reconvene in about 5 minutes.
Yes, let's reconvene at well, it's 7:33. Let's say 7:40, and that gives everyone a chance to have a break. And but we'll start at 7:40 if the Mr. Scavelli can arrange that.
I will do that. And I would just tell everyone who's on and the people that popped on, we're going to end the meeting now. If Jonathan can do that for me, since he's got the host duties right now, and then just log back in here at 7:40, according to what Mr. Bidendijk has requested. So we'll see all of you very soon.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you.